Thank you so much for coming to the California Council on Science and Technology's briefing on negative emissions. This is the last event of CCST Science and Technology Week this week, where we celebrate the role of science informing policy and try to demonstrate how CCST is here to be of service to decision makers such as yourselves. The theme for this year's CCST S&T Week was Achieving California's Carbon Neutrality Goals. So today's briefing is offered in partnership with the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies to cover negative emissions, and it's going to be the first briefing in a series we're doing on achieving our carbon neutrality goals. I'm Sarah Brady, by the way, Deputy Director of CCST. And I'm happy to introduce Sarah Seltzer, our moderator today from Stanford. Dr. Seltzer is the Managing Director of Stanford's Carbon Storage Center. Prior to that, she held several positions over 25 years at Chevron. She has a PhD in geology and will be able to share a lot of her expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Is this on? Okay, great. Okay, human activities, including land use changes and the exploitation of fossil fuels, have increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and is a leading cause of climate change. California has set an ambitious goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. That's 25 years, folks. We've made great progress in reducing emissions by building up our renewables capacity, but that will not be enough. There's growing consensus that we will also need significant negative emissions. By negative emissions, we mean the physical removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The experts on the panel with me here today are here to talk about the technological and natural pathways to achieve negative emissions to meet California's climate goals. I will now introduce each panel member and ask them to tell us a little bit about their background. Sarah Baker from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Baker, and I'm a staff scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I am a part of a team of 25 authors who last week released a report, a peer-reviewed report, outlining how California can achieve carbon neutrality by removing 125 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions from the air by 2045. The report is comprehensive in scope. It looks at how we can remove carbon dioxide from the air, how we can store it safely underground, and the cost of all of the steps in between. The major finding of the report is that we have the practices and technologies today to do this, and the overall cost of these practices and technologies is projected to be less than the amount California spends on managing trash. I'm happy to talk more about what we learned as we go on.
Dick Cameron from the Nature Conservancy.
Good afternoon. My name is Dick Cameron. I'm the Director of Land Science for the Nature Conservancy in California. For those folks not familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we've been active in California for over 60 years, focusing on the direct protection of lands and waters important for biodiversity globally. And I head up a team that works on a number of different issues, from Sierra Nevada forest restoration to endangered species recovery. My particular background is in conservation planning, land use change, and spatial planning. And so I'm going to talk today about what we call natural climate solutions, which is essentially the opportunity that protection and restoration of nature presents to mitigate climate change. A number of different pathways, such as planting trees, preserving forests, creating new wetlands, all represent viable pathways using the mechanism of photosynthesis. So these are proven technologies that obviously have been operating to regulate the carbon balance for as long as we've had plants. And so I'll talk more about that as an opportunity and how it's a complement to other technological solutions, as well as the opportunity to pair avoided emissions. So we have emissions from land use change and land use activities that we can reduce emissions from, as well as accelerating the pump of CO2 out of the atmosphere that ecosystems represent.
Thank you. And again, my name is Sarah Saltzer. I'm a geologist by training. I worked for 25 years for Chevron, mainly here in California. I'm currently the managing director of Stanford Center for Carbon Storage, and this organization conducts fundamental research to address critical questions related to modeling and monitoring carbon dioxide that is injected and stored in geologic formations. I'm also the managing director of the Stanford Carbon Initiative, which brings together faculty from across campus to address the dual challenge of meeting the world's rising demand for energy while also needing to drastically reduce and mitigate carbon emissions. The fourth member of the panel, Jeffrey Long from UC Berkeley, unfortunately will not be able to join us today. He has the flu, so he is keeping us all away from that, which is good. So to kick it off, I'm gonna ask the panel just one or two questions which we'll address, and then what we want to do is turn it over to the audience because we know that you've got a lot of questions, and that's probably the better place for us to spend the bulk of our time. So I want to just start with what are negative emissions and what technologies exist today that we can use to achieve negative emissions. Let's start with Sarah.
So we define negative emissions. We define negative emissions as pulling carbon dioxide directly out of the air. The technologies that we evaluated as being sort of most ready and available to get us to 125 million tons are natural and working land restoration. This is essentially restoring land so that we can have plants and soils start storing carbon rather than emitting carbon. The most impactful solution we found is using our waste biomass, putting it to work to convert it to renewable fuels and carbon dioxide that we then safely store. So these plants already did the hard work of capturing the carbon dioxide from the air, being powered by solar energy. And this is a set of practices and technologies to collect this waste biomass that otherwise would have re-emitted the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And then creating fuels that allow us to reduce our emissions faster. And then the third set of technologies that we assessed was direct air capture. And these are machines that directly pull carbon dioxide out of the air. That's their sole purpose. While they are the most expensive set of solutions today, they're also the most flexible because they don't rely on land or biomass availability. Their cost can decrease rapidly with deployment. And again, all of these technologies and practices are available today. And I can talk more in depth about any of them if there are questions.
Dick?
Nothing really more to add. I think Sarah did a great job sort of laying out the different pathways for negative emissions. I'm happy to talk more about the opportunities that ecosystems and changes to conservation and land management represent. But I don't know if you want to talk about weathering or...
Absolutely. So one question is, if we capture CO2 from the air or from waste biomass, what are we going to do with it? And the answer is we can put it back in the ground. So the options for this, there are a few. First of all, we have a number of oil fields in the state of California, which are either fully depleted or partially depleted. And we can take CO2 that has been captured and transport it to these oil fields and inject it back into the subsurface. And what makes oil fields very amenable to this is that they actually store oil and gas for millions of years. So they're geologically very well suited to take the CO2. They've got typically a cap rock that's necessary, and then they have the reservoir properties that make sense to put CO2 back in them. Another option is to put it in saline aquifers, and there are many saline aquifers across the state of California which you would never use for drinking water because they do not have the properties you would want for drinking water. And so these saline aquifers can also be used to store CO2. Again, you need to properly geologically characterize these aquifers and ensure that you have the right characteristics to make sure that it makes sense to permanently store your CO2 in them. But if you've done the proper work, then they also make a good spot to put the CO2. So I guess another question we have is, what are the most pressing barriers to implementation of the technologies that are available today? What's keeping us from doing it right now? Sarah?
That's a tough one. So, as I mentioned, all of the technologies necessary are available, but this would require us to do some new things in California. We have not yet implemented geologic storage in California, although this is done all over the world at amounts of about 100 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. And it's safe and proven, as Sarah mentioned. In terms of transporting carbon dioxide, that was part of our assessment. And while we can move carbon dioxide around the state from its source to where we put it underground using trucks, and you might see these refrigerated carbon dioxide liquid trucks on the freeway today, the most economical option is a carbon dioxide pipeline. Carbon dioxide pipelines also exist elsewhere in the country. They traverse entire states. We do not have carbon dioxide pipelines yet in California. So these are just a few of the new things we need to do. And in terms of policy and other barriers, I can't address that question.
Yeah, I'll just give a sense a little bit more about some of the negative emissions that we can achieve from natural climate solutions or natural systems. So one of them, you think about the redwood forest, you've got huge stores of carbon stored in those trees as well as in their root mass and in the soils. And when you think about ways to enhance that, one of the ways in which is to start to manage our forests differently. So we've got opportunities to harvest less frequently, less intensively, take trees from below, remove diseased trees. That can accelerate the growth of these large trees, and that really can pack on carbon very quickly. Other examples, just in terms of types of pathways, are wetland restoration, both freshwater wetland restoration, where we can restore agricultural lands or grasslands to wetlands, or tidal wetlands, where we can restore that. That can also accumulate peat soil very quickly in biomass. I would just think of the barriers. Some of them have scientific barriers, lack of certainty around the magnitude of the benefit, maybe relating to whether they're emitting under different climate features. But mostly for a lot of these there are programs that exist in the state to implement them. So I would argue that a lot of the barriers are really policy drivers and funding associated with motivating private landowners to engage in these types of activities. And where we can sort of design policies that have farmers, ranchers, landowners take actions such as planting trees or managing their crops differently or planting cover crops, we can achieve these reductions, these negative emissions really quickly. And so I think that the policy framework is generally there. I think the enhancements to that along with funding will accelerate a lot of this.
So when it comes to geologic storage, we actually know how to do it. CO2 has been stored since the 70s. It's used in Texas. It's been injected into oil fields for enhanced oil recovery. They know how to do it. They've been doing it for years. They've got a lot of infrastructure there to do it. Here in California, we don't have any CO2 pipelines. We don't have the infrastructure. So there are some of the major hurdles are going to be cost hurdles in getting that infrastructure set up in order to be able to do it. There are other issues that are more on the regulatory side of things, the cost side of things, and then also the social acceptance side of things. The public needs to be educated as to what we mean by geologic storage, where it will be, what the potential implications are, and we need to do a good job of educating the public as to what we're talking about doing. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to the audience and hear what your questions are, and we'll see if we can answer any of your questions. And as anyone asks a question, I will be repeating it so that it can be recorded, I guess.
My name is Evan Edgar. I'm an engineer from the California Compost Coalition. And the first tier is natural working land solutions that do with compost use. It's the easiest, it's the most cost effective, and it's a first tier. So I'd like to find out more about compost use. And then I manage garbage in the state of California. I represent the garbage industry as a whole, both refuse hauler and organic composters. So this is the best solution I've heard of is is not only using more compost, but taking all the anaerobic digestion and we make biomethane and put it back in the same truck. So we have a CNG truck, but we use renewable natural gas, and we have a pathway at carbon now, which is carbon negative. So today we're making carbon negative fuel, put it in the same truck that collects it, and we take the compost to natural working lands. The only thing that's missing is funding.
Okay, so was there a question in there about our thoughts on compost use?
I heard a lot about geological solutions here, which is the third tier, most expensive. So the lead off here was all about oil reserves in the ground. I was hoping to hear more about solutions about composting is the most cost-effective solution. So the lead off was all about carbon storage in oil fields, and I'm talking about big soil, not big oil.
Okay, great. So the question is, what can we do with compost? I'll hand it to you, Dick.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a good point to talk about. So you've got negative emissions. You've got things that are actually pumping CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then you've got avoided emissions. So you've got compost diverted from a landfill where it would create methane, which is going to cause emissions. So there's both elements there. There's both. Once it gets into the soil, presumably it will promote, enhanced productivity, which will pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But a big part of the climate benefit of compost diversions to rangelands, to grasslands particularly, is that avoided emissions benefit, as you pointed out, and you talked about it turning into a fuel. It's an area that certainly has a lot of interest and a lot of political support around the state. The Marine Carbon Project and Dr. Wendy Silver really pioneered a lot of this science. I think there's questions around the scalability of it. Where do you put it? I think a lot of her research was really focused on grasslands, whereas later studies have started to think about would you put it in cultivated croplands, and I haven't seen as much science around that. Some of the presumed benefits are enhanced water storage, so that biomass in the soil actually can reduce the actual irrigation demand from crops. For rangelands, that's not relevant because they're not irrigated. There is some sort of, it's emerging science, so there's not a lot of certainty that this is something that has a huge pathway. I think that piece of it is being borne out over time. I know that NRCS is looking at ways to do trials to figure out if it's efficacious or really effective in different parts of the state. And then finally, just related to, there's some concerns around, are there trade-offs with plant biodiversity? As you add nutrients to relatively nutrient-poor California soils that have biodiversity because they're nutrient poor, will you see some sort of trade-off in plant cover that can reduce biodiversity?
Yes? Okay.
We did evaluate using our municipal solid waste, the biogenic fraction in our report, and this is a great source of negative emissions biomass. We did look at using anaerobic digestion of waste and producing renewable natural gas. That could get us about 7 million tons of negative emissions per year. By far the most impactful use was of gasification of municipal solid waste. We have a lot of municipal solid waste in California, and this is the lowest cost option, and it gets us the most carbon dioxide from our trash. So this is gasification of municipal solid waste to hydrogen, to create a renewable fuel. So yes, utilizing our waste is a great strategy.
And we're gasifying wood chips today to make biochar. Biochar is a great carbon negative solution. So that's going on today with wood chips only. I would want to gasify garbage, but we can have clean wood chips from the forest and from the urban sector to make the gasify to make biochar and energy and hydrogen. That's a great plan.
Great.
Yes?
You talked about the pipelines that already exist in Texas and other places. Can you talk about areas that have created pipelines that are not for existing purposes, that are purely for this purpose, and where has that happened, and how maybe, what budget focus, so how has that happened? What was the maybe political impetus to get it done, and what was the financial input to get it done? And you don't have to have all the answers.
Okay, good. Thank you for that last one. I can say that the existing CO2 pipelines are in the, to repeat the question was CO2 pipelines, why are they there, what was the political impetus, and how did they get in place? So in Texas, it was because there's some fields, oil fields, where they're actually using CO2 from natural accumulations of CO2. They're taking that, they build the pipelines to get it to oil fields because CO2 can actually be used to enhance oil recovery from these existing fields. With an oil field, you usually first have primary recovery, then sometimes you do some water injection to get more out of the field, and then a third thing you can do is add CO2 to get even more oil and gas out of the field. And so that's why that whole system was built up in Texas. And so it's there. What's happening now, very slowly in Texas, is trying to turn the tide a little bit so that they don't use the natural occurring CO2, but instead capture CO2 and use that for the enhanced oil recovery. There still is not very much going on in Texas with CO2 that's captured, but hopefully in the future there will be more. The other state that has a CO2 pipeline is the state of Wyoming. Kind of goes diagonally right across the state, and in Wyoming they've got a number of coal-fired power plants. They also have a number of oil fields, so that is working well. They're capturing the CO2 at the power plants and using that pipeline to transport the CO2 to the partially depleted oil fields. And right now in California, we don't have any of that infrastructure. We don't have the pipelines. Yeah. Do you want to also address the CO2 transportation? No, okay. Yes?
In, I think it was 2013, the National Research Council released a report about induced seismicity associated with energy storage. One of the issues they highlighted was carbon sequestration, deep underground carbon sequestration being associated with induced seismicity or earthquakes. I admit I've only just flipped through the report. I do acknowledge that you mentioned at least you need to be do further work to evaluate exactly where an appropriate location is. But if you want to address the risk of earthquakes from deep storage.
Yeah, so that is a concern. So the question has to do with induced seismicity or causing earthquakes by injecting CO2 into storage sites. So that is a concern, but we believe it can be mitigated. And I'll give you an example of how. So in the state of Oklahoma, they had some wastewater wells, and they were injecting wastewater into an aquifer. And so again, that was water, but I'm going to use this as an example. They found that they actually did induce a number of earthquakes, even in the magnitude 3, 4 level. And what it turns out was happening is that the aquifer was sitting right on top of bedrock, and the bedrock had some faults in it. And when they were increasing the pressure in the aquifer by injecting the water, they were actually causing some slip on some faults that was in the bedrock, and that's what was causing the earthquakes. So what this means is when you come up with a site for your storage, you want to make sure that it's properly characterized and it has the right conditions for what you're trying to do. So I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you have a cap rock, which goes over the reservoir because that keeps everything in place, and your oil fields typically have that. Well, you also want to make sure that you have a bottom seal, so something that separates the place where you're storing your CO2 from the underlying bedrock. To keep it in its spot so that you don't run into this problem of pressurizing up the basement, which is what was going on in Oklahoma. So what this means is you need to bring in your earth scientists, your geologists, your geophysicists, and make sure that they've properly characterized the site so that you don't run into those issues. Want to add?
So as part of our report, we evaluated California's storage capacity for negative emissions and looking at only those safe storage places. And we found that California has at least 100 years of storage under the Central Valley for a rate of about 125 million tons per year, up to about 1,000 years of storage. So the state is blessed with a lot of safe storage volume.
Yes?
On the note of storage capacity in the Central Valley, is any of that capacity threatened by aquifer depletion and subsidence that's happening as a result of that, or are these occurring in different strata?
So you're asking about aquifer depletion in the Central Valley?
Well, so groundwater depletion causing subsidence within the Central Valley, does that threaten the capacity for underground gas storage, or are these occurring in different geologic strata?
Okay, so you're wondering, I guess the question to restate it is the geologic sites considered in the Central Valley, have those already been depleted due to groundwater depletion, and does it limit the number of sites?
You lose pore space.
As you lose pore space. Do you want to, you're familiar more with the California ones you looked at?
I was not the geologist on our report, but I mean, all of these considerations were taken into account when we estimated. So, yeah, we only looked at safe storage that wouldn't, ruin our natural resources.
Yes.
It's fine if you don't know the answer to this question, but has the US EPA actually permitted any Class 6 carbon sequestration wells in the country?
Yes, one. Perhaps a second one, but there's definitely one in Illinois, and I believe there was a second one that may have been permitted, but I'm not sure if it's actually being used anymore.
The one in Illinois is associated with the power plant?
I believe it's more agricultural, I believe. But don't hold me to that. Yeah. Yes.
I had a question. You were talking about the municipal solid waste. I think we're part of the biomass stream. And I was at there's a joint committee hearing on Monday where one of the commenters was saying that ARB doesn't consider solid waste a renewable fuel. I wasn't sure if there's how you characterize in your report. Does it dovetail with what that comment and how ARB is thinking about it, or is there something that needs to change in order for your scenarios to be able to fit and achieve the reduction potential that it states?
To rephrase the question has to do with solid waste and how it fits in.
So municipal solid waste has, many different components, of course, and some of these, are biogenic in nature, so they are made out of, trees or food, green waste, things like that, and then some fraction of the municipal solid waste is made from fossil fuels. In fact, most everything we touch in our daily lives is made from fossil fuel carbon in some way. But the fraction that is biogenic is the fraction that we considered in the report, like cardboard, waste from waste wood, things like that, paper. So does that answer your question? And I'm not familiar.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe you need a distinction in the municipal solid waste that doesn't necessarily, it could be consistent with how ARP or how the commenter was portraying it. So.
Right, yeah, we just looked at the subset that's biogenic, so the plants took the carbon dioxide out of the air already.
Yes?
Stand up. I had a question related to the direct capture. So your report identifies 125 million tons per year using different strategies. Can you speak to what proportion of that would be achieved using direct air capture? And then also, what are we doing currently as it relates to direct air capture that would need to be wrapped up?
So the question has to do with direct air capture and how much in the report is attributable to direct air capture.
So we evaluated sets of solutions. We looked at over 50 pathways for negative emissions, and we looked at the cost of all those different pathways and how can we put together those solutions to achieve the lowest cost. Our lowest cost set of solutions relied on natural solutions. That gets us 25 million tons. Then the next higher cost relies on conversion of our waste biomass through primarily gasification to hydrogen. That gets us about 84 million tons. And then the next tranche of negative emissions could be supplied by direct air capture. and that would be about 16 million tons. But as it is flexible, if we have less biomass availability, less land treated, then we could increase the amount of direct air capture for a higher total system cost. I believe I forgot the second part of your question.
Just what are we doing currently around direct air capture?
So there are 3 companies worldwide that have deployed direct air capture units. There are 2 main technologies, and I believe the total amount of deployed capacity today is thousands of tons. I could be off on that. Of course, we need to get to millions of tons. In terms of what's happening in the state with direct air capture, I'm not aware of any activities with deploying direct air capture machines in the state currently.
Yes?
Could you associate costs with some of those technologies that you're talking about? I get a sense of how much it's going to cost us to do this.
Okay, so the question has to do with how much is this all going to cost for the various different technologies?
So system-wide, our lowest cost of solutions would be about $8 billion per year. That sounds like a lot. It's less than 1% of the state's GDP. And in terms of, we evaluated all of these practices and technologies on the basis of how many dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. So just to give you a feel for it, the natural solutions, I believe, averaged around $11 per ton. And then all the way to the direct air capture was around $200 per ton. Of course, those prices will go down as the technologies are deployed for the direct air capture. So that's sort of the range.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that when we look at cost of mitigating climate change impacts, we can look at the sort of direct implementation costs, which I think is what Sarah's report focused on. But that often you'll generate other avoided costs, such as urban tree planting can reduce energy use in buildings, things like that, as well as the avoided treatment costs. So if you preserve a forested watershed, for example, the treatment cost of that water quality that you need to do can be foregone. You don't need to pay for that because you've maintained the ecosystem's ability to do that. So our ability to characterize the full costs and benefits of these interventions is really just emerging, but it's really important to consider the benefit side when you think about climate change.
It's also important to make sure if you hear costs being thrown around that you're hearing full life cycle costs. The storage costs themselves may not be that much, the geologic storage costs per ton, but you have to then include the capture costs, the transportation costs, all of it to really get the full life cycle. So anytime you're looking at these options, you need to start to dig and ask questions to make sure you're not just getting a portion of the costs. Yes?
I would just add to what you said, don't forget there would have to be monitoring forever, basically.
Yes?
So in terms of, you mentioned forestry, forest management changes, is there a point in a life cycle of a tree where there's greater capture? I'm thinking of raising teenage kids, there's a certain point where there's a huge factor of resources being utilized. Is that the same for trees?
Okay, wait, let me just say that question again. The question is, when are trees going to capture the most CO2 for us, I think?
Yeah, I have a 14-year-old son, so you're talking about how much milk they're going to drink? Yeah, no, so it's really, the thing about this is there's always sort of conventional wisdom that younger trees would pack on more biomass per relative to older trees, but the science is changing on that a little bit, where they're finding that these big redwood trees that are over 1,000 years old are actually, the rate of sequestration is still quite high. There are points in which forests are going to become more senescent, old, and more decomposition's happening, where they'll start to emit more. And that varies quite a bit by types of forests. So you have a much longer productive phase in wet forests, whereas like our Sierra Nevada forest, dry forest, can end up being sort of more towards that decomposition stage at a younger age. That's one way to think about it.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a huge supply of biomass, biogenic biomass in California from agriculture, forest, and urban. We have a huge demand of compost use in the Central Valley with soil. And there's a big initiative called Healthy Soils Initiative. And there's a model called the Cowland Model Commons, it's mentioned inside of your report. And we need the 7.5 million tons per year of compost on irrigated cropland. So that's where the value's at. We have farmers who want to pay for compost use on vineyards, value crop cannabis, wine grapes, nurseries, and strawberries, and that on rangelands like the Marine Carbon Project, these people don't want to pay for the rangeland. The application, there's no value there. So there's a big movement with the Healthy Soils Initiative for healthy soils and healthy people to take all this oversupply of biomass, put it into the soil, and they can have the market achievable with 30% water savings, drought tolerant. So the compost solution is great, and it's a low cost leader. So a leader portfolio is good there on percentages, but I think that with a low cost leader of natural working plants, you can do a lot more there than carbon capture in soil in oil fields, because that's 10 times cost, 20 times cost more. But there's a whole bunch of biomass available, and a lot of soil in Central Valley can use that biomass.
Sarah, would you like to comment or dip on the use of some of this biomass for composting for sequestration?
I was just going to mention your findings so you can chime in quickly, but I think that what's interesting to think about is getting into the actual science behind this and the evidence that this can create sort of a huge pathway for negative emissions. So in the recent study that Sarah's team produced, compost, the soil amendments ended up being about 4 million metric tons annually in 2045 out of about 25 across all these natural pathways. I think the compost amendments maybe was 2 to 3. And that was an assumption of 90% of California's rangelands having some compost application, which is millions and millions of acres. And so it had a very sort of like bullish assessment of the ability to scale this, but it was still only 10% of that natural solutions pathway. So I think it's important to really get into the evidence that this really can create a big pathway, because there's a lot of support for it, and I think it's important to make sure we're putting our funding and putting our incentives to things that are going to generate the biggest return in terms of climate.
The science was that irrigated cropland, so all the 7.5 million acres of irrigated croplands in California, because they can afford the value of compost. Rangelands, we can't get market penetration because they don't want to buy the compost. We've been doing that for years, so we can't sell the compost to cowboys on rangelands, but we can sell the compost to irrigated croplands at 7.5 million acres in California. We can do that. So I think that's where we need to focus the science on irrigated croplands and on rangelands.
Yeah, and I think the point was just that focusing on irrigated croplands may represent a pathway. I think the science is not, it's certainly not out on that. So that would be, I agree with you, that's something to invest in terms of reducing that uncertainty.
We assumed agricultural waste would go toward making biofuels due to the uncertainty, as Dick was just mentioning, around how long that carbon is stored and how much can be stored in soils due to compost. It's not as stable as when you put carbon underground.
Other questions? Yes.
My question is about different types of trees having different properties and capturing carbon differently. Is that kind of science guiding deforestation efforts, or the idea of having trees as crops?
So the question is, different trees, are some better at capturing carbon than others? Versus crops.
Yeah, no question. Some trees grow faster and therefore accumulate more biomass and store more carbon over time. In general, we think of, so the only thing I think that's affecting what types of trees are planted is the projections of actual climate impacts. So if a place is going to be warmer in the future, then foresters and land managers may be selecting for trees that are going to be more drought tolerant. And so I think that's really driving the selection of reforestation trees more than necessarily the growth rates, because there's not, California, I think it's important to align these pathways with social and environmental goals so that we don't plant non-native trees just because they're sequestering carbon and cause trade-offs with food supply or water supply, things like that. So where we can basically think about planting trees that are native within the area, but maybe sort of more drought adapted, that would make sense. It varies quite a bit, like I was talking about. California is a wonderfully diverse place, so the North Coast obviously has quite a bit more Douglas fir, redwood forests. Those are going to accumulate carbon, higher stores of carbon other than the giant sequoias in the Sierra Nevada. But I would say, considering what trees to plant, it's really more a function of the adaptation rather than the growth rates.
Yes, in the back.
If we made these agricultural changes, would there be effects on crop yield or the types of crops we could grow?
So the question is, if we need to capture CO2 by growing crops, would we need to change our crops or adapt them somehow? Or would we get more or less?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly evidence that that amendments to soil and agricultural systems, such as compost and other things, can enhance the productivity. We don't really, I think you looked at biofuels in terms of residual, so there wasn't really the massive. So one concern, obviously, with negative emissions is that we start to grow crops for fuel purposes and displace food production. There's really not that. That's sort of a concern that I think nobody's really concerned with, because we're starting to use scenarios that really treat it as a residue waste stream. But yeah, there is evidence that amendments to soils can enhance productivity. And I mentioned earlier with the compost, when you have more soil organic carbon, you can have more water holding capacity, which in a seasonal drought state is really important and valuable.
Yes.
I haven't read the report, but in your scan of other states and other countries, did you find anyone implementing a program to capture CO2 just for climate protection purposes, as opposed to using it for some other function, whether it's to get oil out of the ground or some other industrial process? I'm thinking of the larger scale economic drivers here. And is anyone other than California looking at doing it just for climate protection purposes? And it leads me to think, do you need another economic lever for it to pencil out?
Okay, so the question is anyone across the globe doing carbon capture and storage for climate protection reasons as opposed to other reasons, essentially? And I can tell you that a lot of the carbon storage projects going on around the globe are for climate protection reasons. So the largest project to date captures 4 million tons a year. It's in offshore Western Australia. It just started within the past 12 months, actually in the last 6 months. There's a major gas field offshore Australia called Gorgon, and it happens to produce a lot of CO2. And so that is now being captured and stored geologically underground in a separate reservoir. And that's being done for climate reasons. There are also projects in Norway that are solely being done for climate reasons. So a lot of the storage that is going on is for climate reasons. There's also, as I mentioned, a lot going on in the US, primarily for enhanced oil recovery. And so that storage has other reasons. Do you want to? Yes, Rhett?
Is most of the storage that's already happening, whether it's happening for climate reasons or for enhanced oil recovery, is most of that going into depleted reservoirs that are existing depleted aging oil fields? Or is it happening in, so having looked at the report, where it's mapped out is just where it's geologically suited as opposed to looking where there's actually space in those reservoirs because it's been depleted. Where has the carbon capture actually been happening
in the world?
It's been happening in both, but more of it has been occurring in depleted or partially depleted oil fields. I think the report actually does a nice job of showing both the potential oil fields that could go in the state of California, as well as the larger picture of the aquifers that we've got.
Is there good economics that you can look at between where you have some existing infrastructure? And,
Exactly.
yeah, right, and knowledge of the fields and
Yes.
seismic and all that.
So, what makes an existing oil field particularly attractive is that it's been studied extensively during the oil extraction process. So it's well understood geologically. And it has some infrastructure right there. And you have a community that's nearby that is familiar with the oil operations and might be more amenable to the injection and storage of CO2 at that site as well. So those are some of the things that make the partially depleted or fully depleted oil fields particularly attractive. If you go to a saline aquifer in an area where there's not a lot of knowledge about what is being proposed, it could be a little bit harder for community acceptance. Yeah, in the back.
On the topic of natural pathways, what are the best available estimates for the contributions that could be had in California from estuaries, tidal marshes, and wetlands?
Okay, so the question has to do with contributions from tidal marshes and wetlands.
Yeah, so tidal marshes and wetlands have some of the, so per area, per acre, some of the highest sequestration rates, sort of on par with forests, just given the accumulation of soil in those productive systems. The challenge is the area available for those restorations. So what we did in our paper was look at presumed scaling up of wetland restoration potential, and found fairly significant, but not relative to forests, fairly low estimates in terms of overall mitigation potential. So in terms of cumulative benefits, by mid-century we found about 21 million metric tons for both tidal and freshwater wetlands. So per year, that's that's about 800,000 tons per year. And those are fairly conservative estimates in terms of the area dedicated to those restoration techniques. But again, in terms of the opportunity per land area, it's actually quite high. It's just there's not that much land area.
Yes?
With regards to technological pathways to module, are there any specialized tax benefits for investors who invest in the development and growth of these machines?
So the question has to do with what kind of tax benefits might there be if you get involved in carbon capture and sequestration? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, so there is a federal tax incentive, 45Q, which for those that store CO2, you can get $50 a ton, so that's a nice incentive. That's been out for a while. Recently, they upped the dollar amount. Legislation is currently undergoing a comment period, and we don't quite have the results of that comment period out, but they're looking at, there are questions about how long you can get that credit for. There are questions right now, you have to have started construction. We don't even know what that means, start construction by 2024. And they're looking at possibly enhancing that as well. So there is some legislation out there. It is beneficial, but there are some questions as to whether it's enough. Yes?
Going back to the question about, or a comment that you made earlier about using biomass as much being about not converting lands to more urban uses. Are you foreseeing then that this would be more using forests that are already in existence to create biomass, or doing some sort of like public-private partnership with farms to convert agricultural land into biomass-producing lands, or something entirely different?
So the question is, how do we get more biomass-producing lands?
Yeah, what's the strategy?
What's the strategy?
I was just going to talk about the forest management. So there's a goal, obviously, with the wildfire threat in California to implement thinning projects. And from those thinning projects, there's a target of 1 million acres a year to thin. And so that's the waste stream that we generate a lot of the forest biomass that's, they're thinner trees, it's material that you can't sort of turn into a 2x4. And those are, that's a good example where you're aligning that with a social and an environmental goal.
Sarah?
Yeah, in terms of biomass availability, we only analyzed waste biomass. So no purpose-grown crops, definitely no cutting down of existing trees. And that amounts to about 56 million bone-dry tons per year, which could give us about 84 million tons per year of negative emissions.
Yes?
I'm a developer of anaerobic digestion facilities using urban waste, food waste, and green waste. And the current pathways at CARB for fuel for RNG back into the on-site fleet is minus 25 to minus 100 grams of CO2 per megajoule. So that's a proven pathway, and I got a lot more projects coming online. And what I find missing from this report is a pathway to define, RNG at 74 million gallons per year of DGE is going to be mandated to procure from local government to implement a law called SB 1383 to get organics out of the landfill, 75% by 2025. So we're doing that. We're taking the methane that used to be in the landfill, we're taking it for biogas, we use it in our fleet that collects and hauls materials. And this report dismisses completely the potential of taking RNG to on-site fleet use today, not something tomorrow for hydrogen, not the 2045, but we're doing this today. We do it over the next 5 years. We're deploying 15,000 CNG fleets with RNG fuel. It's carbon negative. We're doing this now, and somehow this report doesn't capture that opportunity today.
So I'm guessing the question is, what renewable natural gas doesn't seem to be captured in the report.
The carbon is carbon negative today, and the deployment of it is not captured in this report.
Sarah, would you like to comment on that?
So the way to have to achieve negative emissions from renewable natural gas is to either renewable natural gas is the methane portion of biogas. Biogas is generated from wastewater treatment and landfills and dairy manure digesters today. So biogas is CO2 and methane. If you take that CO2 portion and put it underground, that's negative emissions. Or through the combustion of the methane, if you do carbon capture after you extract the energy from that methane, carbon capture on the resulting CO2. So when renewable natural gas is used as a vehicle fuel, and that carbon dioxide that comes out of the tailpipe is not captured, then that is not negative emissions. It's a neutral emission because the carbon dioxide came out of the air and it went back to the air. So the pathways that we evaluated were only negative emissions pathways, both looking at the CO2 portion of biogas and taking that, and also post-combustion capture.
And that's what the CARB did on their pathway for carbonated fuel. This is adopted by CARB. They did a life cycle of that, and CARB has adopted carbonated pathway for RNG today of minus 25. So they have that record.
Just really quickly, it has to do with what you assume as your baseline. If you assume that methane will be emitted anyway, then in some ways the carbon accounting is looking at it as negative, but that's not the way we counted it, as truly pulling carbon dioxide out of the air.
Because it is leaking from the landfill today, so it is being emitted today. The baseline is the leakage from the landfill, so instead we're capturing it in a negative system that's certified by CARB.
Catherine?
Just a clarification on that last exchange. Did you only look at CO2 emissions, or did you look at methane emission avoidance as well? Because I think that may be one of the distinctions with the way AAB is looked at it.
The question is, did the report that came out last week look only at CO2 emissions or methane emissions as well?
So we looked at carbon dioxide, really looking at pulling the carbon dioxide out of the air. The state, as you mentioned, has 1383, SB 1383, which aims at reducing our methane emissions. And so, and again, we're focused on negative emissions and not avoided emissions in the report. And we did make some assumptions that, for example, all of the biogas that is economical to collect would be collected. per current regulation. So landfill gas is captured. Baseline, dairy manure is digested and that methane is captured, and the methane from wastewater is already captured. So does that answer your question? We weren't focused on avoided emissions, mainly negative. And negative is removal of carbon dioxide.
I think we probably have time for one final question. Is there this one? Yes, okay.
So for the conversion of biomass to hydrogen, as stated before, is there sufficient demand for the entire, the amount that is necessary to be effective economically?
So the question is there demand for the hydrogen that we're going to generate doing this?
Certainly, the infrastructure is not there today, but in terms of our lowest cost pathway, that would generate about 3.8 million tons of hydrogen per year, which aligns quite well with the state's projected needs for renewable hydrogen in 2045. Certainly, we're not there yet, but the state is projecting to be there to be able to handle and need that much renewable hydrogen in 2045.
I'd like to thank you all for coming here today and all your great questions and the discussion that we've had over the last hour. We'll be around for a few minutes, so if you have any additional questions or just want to chat, please come on up and talk to us. And as well, if you have any questions for CCST, they'll also be here.